Happy Sabbath. How are you all? I hope you all enjoy this week. Beautiful sunshine, especially after the rain. The air is so fresh. Everything looks so nice, isn't it? Tonight, I continue to pray that the Lord will guide us, lead us, and protect us and our family. I also pray that He will give us strength and courage sufficient for each day. And may His love, joy, and peace fills our hearts and minds continually. Last week, we studied Genesis chapter 4. And the chapter ended with Adam's lineage through Cain. This week's chapter 5 is also about Adam's lineage, 10 generations, but this time is through his son Seth. There are a few observations from this chapter, and I will list them one by one. Number 1, about image. Whose image? Let's go to verse 1. This verse actually reiterates Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 of God's creation of humanity in His likeness. You notice Cain's account of lineage did not begin with this. Okay, let's read verse 1. When God created mankind, He made them in the likeness of God. Pretty much repeat of what was said in Genesis 1:26, as I mentioned. So God created humans in His own image. But what is interesting is in verse 3. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. Well, Adam was after the image of God, and Seth was after the image of Adam. The likeness of Seth is now a reflection of man's, which has inherited some flaws from sin. And yet, because of his obedience and the obedience of his descendants, we read in Luke chapter 3, he, Seth, is in Jesus' genealogy, but not Cain's. Second observation, man's responsibility. As you glance through the genealogy in the previous chapter and also this chapter, you can see families. In the beginning, families was initiated for the purpose of carrying out the plan of God in history, particularly to replicate God's image and to apply His rule or His commandments on earth. After all, the earth is His. He designed it and He created it. And we read this in Psalms. You make Him to rule over the works of your hands. You have put all things under His feet. God delegated men to manage or rule the earth. Besides giving them the responsibility to rule the earth, He also granted them the freedom to choose how to rule it. He can choose whether or not to follow God's way. What that means is man can have a God-fearing family like Seth, or a God-defying family like Cain's. It all depends on whether or not he chooses to exercise his ruling in reflection of God's image. Even until now, God is not going to make man have a God-centered, productive, and fulfilling home life. He would not force us. He sets up the fundamentals of the family and gives man the option of utilizing them or not utilizing them. In this chapter, we see Adam sets up pattern for the entire genealogy. It describes the length of days the head of the family lives until he gives birth to his particular son, and then more births to other sons and daughters. That has no names given. And the total years he lives. And then his final end is death. So this pattern is repeated. And throughout the genealogy, we can see bountiful blessing was given to them, this 10 generation. They had longevity of life. Adam was 939 years old. Seth lived to 912 years old. Kenan 910. And further down is Methuselah, and he lived the longest, 969 years. There are reasons that we can deduce of why they lived so long, perhaps because of the enduring effect of Adam and Eve's pre-fall diet, vegan diet, and most importantly, the fruit from the tree of life. Fourth observation, the contrasting seventh generation. So another observation from this short chapter is that just as Lamech, the seventh generation from Adam through Cain's line, was the focus of attention, so Enoch, the seventh generation from Adam through Seth's line, also attracts attention. Lamech from Adam and Enoch from Seth, both were from the seventh generation, counting from Adam. And one draws positive attention, but the other negative attention. Remember, last week we said the Lamech killed someone. But here this week, we read that Enoch walked with God. Fifth observation. So now let's talk about Enoch walking with God. Walking with God is a phrase expressing piety. Walked means faithful and also indicates Enoch had a very close relationship with God. Enoch's walking with God is contrasting with the other persons recorded in this same chapter who just lived. If you read it, it says so-and-so lived a number of years, etc., right? And then the next thing it says that so-and-so read such and such amount of years, and he gave birth to sons and daughters. They all repeated, just talking about living. So that reminds us that there's a difference between walking faithfully with God and merely just living. So what's the difference? Well, the end result was what? Enoch was taken. That means he didn't die, but the others died. The same Hebrew word taken is expressed as translation in 2 Kings 2, 3, and 5. Remember, Elijah was translated to heaven by the fiery chariots. So that means Enoch went to heaven without dying. Well, why didn't the passage here just explain that Enoch went to heaven? Well, scholars did some research and found out that idea of human taken to heaven was quite familiar to the ancient world. So there were ancient literature about men like Atana, Adepa, and others who did not experience death and were ascended to heaven. Well, I really don't know whether these accounts were true or fictional, but what I'm trying to say is that the idea of taken to heaven is not something strange to the ancient world. So perhaps that's why it did not explain here. Sixth observation, good and evil. In chapter 4 and 5, in the genealogies, we see there are parallel tracks of good and evil, Cain's and Seth's. I can observe that they are flourishing in one another's company. As we study the next chapter, which is next week, we will see the line of good actually start to mix with the line of the evil. The good and the evil become so intertwined that at times they become inseparable. Biblical history is full of examples of this phenomenon, like Solomon and Ahab, who were both successful in worldly terms but suffer from fatal flaws that ultimately ruined them. And then look at Herod the Great. He had a very good reputation with Rome, and he earned prestige and power. He ran away, rebuilt Jerusalem. He gained respect from the Roman world as well as the Jewish leaders and population. Nevertheless, there was evil in him. We read that it was not healthy to be related to him. In protecting his power, he became paranoid and led him to execute those whom he loved. And fast forward to our time, our modern U.S. history has also been torn by the contradictions of good and evil. We have had popular leaders like John F. Kennedy, Nixon, Clinton, etc., who were known for their cleverness in dealing in foreign affairs, domestic policies, and economic expansion. And yet, at the same time, they were also known for their philandering, dishonesty, and moral degradation. Even our Christian churches can be plagued with good and evil. Pastors or church leaders can be effective shepherds, but yet we have heard news of their unwise or insensitive ways in conducting their own lives and ministries. Why does God allow these to go on? This question has troubled philosophers and in all cultures and all eras. And we ourselves also ask similar questions. Why good often accompanied and tainted by evil? And why the spread of evil seems to always get the upper hand? And why the good attempts to stop evil seem so feeble? So to our wonderment, this is how God works in our fallen world. Since he has chosen not to eradicate a fallen world, but to redeem it, he does his mighty work in this imperfect backdrop. Until the final end, evil will always try to find ways to pervert things that is intended for good. Can you see why we call it the great controversy? The good is at war with the evil. In spite of this seemingly doom and gloom of sin and failures, we must recognize that God can turn these curses into blessings. We often observe bad choices turned into growing experience, such as King David's, such as Saul, who became Paul, and many other examples. And the most obvious curse from sin is death, right? And the genealogies have shown us that each life ends with death. But in God's mercy, death can be a blessing that brings relief from a cursed, suffering world. Let me give you Adam as an example. I quote from the book Patriarchs and Prophets. Adam's life was one of sorrow, humility, and contrition. When he left Eden, the thought that he must die thrilled him with horror. He was first made acquainted with the reality of death in the human family when Cain, his firstborn son, became the murderer of his brother. Filled with the keenest remorse for his own sin and doubly bereaved in the death of Abel and the rejection of Cain. Adam was bowed down with anguish. He witnessed the widespreading corruption that was finally the cause, the destruction of the world by a flood. And though the sentence of death pronounced upon him by his Maker had at first appeared terrible, yet after beholding for nearly 1,000 years the result of sin, he felt that it was merciful in God to bring to an end a life of suffering and sorrow. Though we cling tenaciously to this life, Paul reminds us that to live is Christ and to die is gain, Philippians 1:21, and that death has lost its sting when Christ died on the cross, give us salvation. Seventh observation. The name Noah is prophetic. Let's look at verse 29. He named him Noah and said, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hand caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." Lamech, which is Noah's father, and this Lamech is different from the Lamech in Cain's line. While Lamech expresses his hope for relief from the curse of toil, so he named his son Noah. Noah means rest and comfort. Comfort. We see Noah's godly and faithful life. Paul said by faith, Noah became an heir of the righteousness. Let me read to you. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. Hebrews 11:7. And rest would come through Noah's descendants, but centuries later. Remember this passage? "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. In hearing this, the tired and weary people felt comforted. Through Noah's line, Christ came. So Noah, the meaning is rest and comfort. It is prophetic. Eighth observation. I have a diagram here that will show you some more interesting things from this genealogy. Look, you see this 10 generation from Adam all the way to Noah, right? What did I see? Well, number one, Adam was still alive when the 9th generation of Lamech was born. And Lamech was Noah's father. Adam died just 126 years before Noah was born. That means Adam knew his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson. Number 2, Methuselah lived longer than anyone else recorded in the Bible, 969 years. Number 3, Methuselah died the same year that the great flood waters came upon the earth. According to Ellen White, he died shortly before the flood arrived. She also said he and others, perhaps Lamech, worked side by side with Noah to keep alive the knowledge of the true God. 4th, when Enoch was taken from the earth, his ancestors from 5 generations back were still alive, even Seth and Adam. Can you imagine how Adam felt when his great-great-great-great-grandson was translated to where he was before and before he sinned. So, I have a summary here. So, what does this chapter teach us about God? The story is developing, and so far, we see how God worked to redeem humanity through the imperfect and dysfunctional families of the biblical patriarchs of Noah, and then later on Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Genesis is a book that speaks about relationships between God and his creation, between God and humankind, and about human choices. And so, what does this chapter teach us about who we are as a human? The genealogy in Genesis 5 becomes more significant to us when we realize that it lists part of our own genealogy, because all of us trace our roots back to God's creation of Adam, the first man. And does this chapter tell us how we should live? Enoch walked with God. Walking is a familiar Bible picture found over 200 times. It was the most common way of travel in Bible days. So the Spirit of God has taken this common, easy to understand picture or symbol and used it as a description of life and the journey of life. Enoch walked with God. The Old Testament several phrases about walking. It talks about walking before the Lord, Psalms 169. That's about integrity. And the Bible also talks about walking after the Lord, Deuteronomy 13:4, and that's about zeal and intensity. But here the Bible says Enoch walked with God, and that's about intimacy, a very close relationship with God. Happy Sabbath.